But today we're focusing on the new European Accessibility Act, or EAA, and how specifically it impacts your business. So just by means of a brief agenda, as always, we're going to have a quick overview of what the Act is, what it aims to achieve, look at the businesses that are kind of impacted by the legislation, and importantly, those that are actually listed within the regulation as having specific obligations. Then we'll talk about the products in scope and the services in scope. And then we'll look at the regulatory standard. Those of you that have listened to me bang on about GPSR over recent months will hear me lamenting the fact that there is no standard for which we can all conform to, and it would make our lives a lot easier. Well, there is for EAA, so we'll talk about that regulatory standard and how we access that pertinent information. And then we'll talk about a little bit about the sectors that are impacted. And then I want to do a bit of a deep dive, particularly on e-commerce providers, because I'm thinking, I don't know, because I haven't looked specifically at our attendees for today, but I know from conversations with our clients and other businesses that we support over recent months that it's really their e-commerce provision that's worrying them when they think about EAA. So we're going to focus on those e-commerce providers and what regulatory compliance looks like from that perspective. And then we'll talk about some exemptions. Yes, there are some exemptions from EAA, which is always quite good. And then you're always asking me about penalties for non-compliance and how they enforce this kind of regulation. So I'll touch on that. And then importantly at the end, from a kind of starting stop today, how should we be preparing to comply? And then finally, we've now mapped out our webinar activity to the end of 2025. So I've got links at the end to the forthcoming webinars that we're going to be doing up until the end of this year. Okay, so an overview. Where has this kind of stemmed from? So at its core, the EAA, so the European Accessibility Act, aims to address the assertion that the UN made. So the UN's Convention on the Right... Sorry, my dog has just found a fly and has decided to go chase him around the office after said fly. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities asserted that those people that have long-term physical, mental, or intellectual or sensory impairments face several barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with the rest of us, with others. So that's really at the heart of this regulation, is kind of like addressing that assertion that there are significant barriers in society that hold back those with disabilities. And some of the legislation's measures are also anticipated to be going to help other persons who experience maybe functional limitations. So they could be, you might hear it referred to as helping the elderly or pregnant women or those with small children, those people that have kind of like other functional limitations. The EAA and the measures that are going to be introduced as a result of the EAA may actually, as a byproduct, help those individuals as well. So if you've listened to me on any regulatory webinars in the past, you'll hear me talking about how regulation across all member states is massively disjointed, but there are significant disparities concerning the accessibility of products and services for persons with disabilities. And the EU this is the culmination of something like a 10-year study into what those barriers look like. And they talk about, the social barriers for those that have the disabilities themselves, but they also talk about how that fragmentation of that regulatory picture hinders effectively the smooth running of the free market, because products and services that are deemed to be accessible in some member states may not be compliant with accessibility regulation in another member state. So that stifles kind of competition, and it leads to inflated costs for consumers, obviously it curtails innovation and it disproportionately impacts EU-based businesses that sit within the SME category, because they simply can't afford to have different compliance measures for different regulatory regimes across the EU. So that's fundamentally, it's kind of like got a social and an economic driver to this. Social because we want to improve the lives of those people with disabilities, but also economic driver is the fact that the EU could see that by having harmonized regulation, that the producers of those products and services, those accessibility products and services, or accessible products and services that they all had to adhere to, would basically help the smooth running of the internal market as well. The directive is designed to complement the existing directive here, so 2018/1972. That directive sets requirements on equivalent access and choice for end users with disabilities. So it sets requirements around the affordability of internet access and voice communications, and it sets requirements around the affordability and availability of related equipment and services for consumers with disabilities. So there's already some legislation in there, and obviously all of the member states have come up with their own derivatives, but then the EU Accessibility Act kind of complements what's already there and harmonizes what's already there. And like I say, it's a culmination of years of research, an entire EU-wide consultation that had a lot of consumer involvement and surveys. And the EU member states, so that this was actually brought into force in 2019, and the member states had until mid-2022 to transpose that directive into their local law. And now the hard compliance deadline is basically the end of this month. So we've had like a 3-year transition period to comply with this. So what's it aiming to achieve? What's its objective? So as I say, it's the culmination of an EU-wide consultation that I mentioned just now, that basically uncovered that there was not enough accessible goods and services within the EU internal market. That study identified that people with disabilities were largely overlooked as a segment of consumers. They were largely overlooked. That they faced economic, social, and political barriers to kind of active participation in society. And then obviously the regulatory fragmentation across the member states was deemed to be largely responsible for the poor level of accessible product and service provision. And as I said, it was impeding the smooth running of the block in addressing that shortfall. It also focused on what's referred to as the built environment, and transport as well as what the other ones, information and communication, technologies, all these things that could be deemed to be key enablers to achieve that accessibility and participation of disabled people in society. So the built environment and transport has been a big focus. And then obviously standardizing accessibility requirements and standards at the Commission level, which you'll hear me talk about a lot. That's usually at the level where we see regulation. That would significantly reduce the compliance burden for small businesses. And then in return, you'd see a lot more, this is what we're anticipating, a lot more fairly priced and competitive products, and generally the presence of accessible goods and services for the disabled will just be enhanced as a result of this act. So as I say, the drivers have been both social and economic, so to improve the lives of those with disabilities, but also to create a more optimally functioning internal market for those accessible goods and services, which is always at the core of what the Commission does essentially. And then there's other things that I mentioned, job creation, where accessibility expertise is needed, and stimulation of innovation and so on. So again, very much socially and economically driven. So the products and services that are essentially the focus of the Act were born from that lengthy impact assessment that was undertaken. It started kind of like about 2015. And I think reading through the report, I think they started off with about 87 goods and services that were identified under the UN Convention as being applicable. And thankfully, they whittled this down to the 15 areas roughly that you see here. And that was done partly through public consultation and also partly by detailed assessment of kind of divergent approaches taken by each member state to their domestic accessibility legislation. And this is now like the definitive list of products and services that fall within the scope of EAA. That's not to say that, you know, the Commission in its wisdom couldn't over time look to add to these as they monitor the implementation of any kind of regulation. This list may grow, but at the time, for the time being, this is kind of like the definitive focus of the EAA. So I'm always talking about how it would be wonderful to have a standard to which we can all adhere, and everything's a lot easier to navigate, and we know what we're doing to comply. We do have that with the EAA. So I've kind of split this into 3 sections. So we've got the directive itself, which is Directive 2019/882. And the real core parts of that to look at are the annexes, so the Annex 1 to 6 at the very end of that regulation. So that's where all of the juicy detail is that, you know, we should be considering when we're thinking about the services that we're providing or the products that we're developing. So Annex 1 covers the core accessibility requirements for those products and services. So to give you examples, it includes stuff like, you know, the instructions for product use must be made available via more than one sensory channel. That could be one thing that it puts forward. Or instruction manuals must be presented in an understandable way, or presented to users in ways that they can perceive, and presented in fonts of adequate size and suitable shape. So that's just one example of an accessibility requirement that's listed in Annex 1, and it's quite a chunky annex, and you need to go through and see which ones kind of like apply to you. And then Annex 2 gives kind of like what they refer to as non-binding examples of possible solutions to meeting those accessibility requirements. So Annex 1 is about these are the requirements that you must comply with, and then Annex 2 gives you potential solutions to those requirements. So it might be, you know, providing those user instructions as an electronic file that can be read by a computer using screen readers, so that people with impaired vision can access that information. So Annex 2 gives you all of those kind of potential solutions that the regulation would deem as good solutions to those accessible requirements listed in Annex 1. And then Annex 3 concerns the built environment where any services under the scope of the directive are provided. So that talks about things like, you know, the use of exits and evacuation routes and concepts for emergency planning. It talks about the use of equipment and facilities used in the provision of a certain service and so on. So Annex 3 is about that built environment. Annex 4 is about your conformity assessment procedure. So with any regulation, or with a lot of, well, all regulation that the EU brings in, especially around kind of safety, environmental measures, and in this case, accessibility, there's a conformity assessment procedure, which obviously for products, accessible products, that's going to be governed by the CE mark. So Annex 4 covers the process for conducting those internal assessments and affixing the CE mark. And then Annex 5 focuses on those accessible services. So obviously we can't affix a CE mark to a service. So what we're doing in this case is we're drawing up a kind of service compliance report. And Annex 5 gives you details of the kind of stuff that you would need to include in that statement or in that report that confirms that your service is compliant with the EAA. And then Annex 6, there is a potential derogation within this regulation, which I will come to, and some of you will be thinking, yay! Annex 6 provides the criteria for you to determine whether you can use that derogation, essentially. So the derogation is around you potentially proving that complying with this regulation would impose a disproportionate burden. And if you want to use that derogation, then there's very strict criteria and cost calculations that are detailed in Annex 6 that you would have to show that you'd kind of carried out an assessment using that criteria to determine that you could use the derogation and therefore not have to comply with the EAA. But we'll come to this. I've got that in a future slide. But the actual standard itself is EN 301-549, and that's referred to as accessibility requirements for ICT products and services. So that standard is going to be what we call the presumptive standard for conformity. So if you want to show that your assets meet the EAA compliance requirements, they likely need to conform with that standard. So the standard it's fantastic. It's a meaty document, but it's very, very detailed. It provides for all of the different kind of, broadly speaking, disabilities that are within scope and considered as part of the EAA. So, you know, those being able to make sure that those with disabilities relating to vision, perception of colour, hearing loss, limited hearing, limited vocal capability, limited strength, limited reach, those with photosensitive seizure triggers, limited cognition, language, learning, and so on, they're all considered. So it lays out kind of like the heart of these people for which the EAA is designed to improve their life and their access. And then it breaks it down in terms of what you actually need to do to prove that your products or services, or get your products or services deemed to be accessible. So, you know, it breaks it down into generic requirements. So the use of biometrics, locking or toggle controls, simultaneous user actions. You know, if you're designing hardware like laptops, does the opening of the laptop require two hands, or can it be opened with one hand? That kind of thing. It covers off ICT with two-way voice communication, so real-time text functionality, caller ID, alternatives to voice-based services, alternatives to video-based services. And then it goes into detail around ICT with video capabilities, so captioning playback, preserving captioning, spoken subtitles, and then the development or the manufacturing of hardware. So products with speech outputs, stationary ICT like kiosks and self-service terminals, ticket machines, so those kind of like ICT products that have mechanically operable parts like those ticket machines. And then it also covers web content, which is where we're going to focus today, really. It covers web content, but it heavily refers back to what's called the WCAG, which I'll come to in a second, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But it also covers, you know, non-web documents, so letters, spreadsheets, emails, books, pictures, presentations. How can we make those accessible via document readers? editors or media players. It covers software, so the operability of software, compatibility of software with assistive technology. Our son is severely dyslexic, so he has accessibility technology on his laptop that then works with Microsoft Office and so on. So it's quite clever to see how that all works. So there's a whole load of stuff in there in that standard for all the different types of product or service that are in scope of the regulation and what you have to make sure happens to your product or service to be deemed accessible. Now, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, we're currently on version 2.1, and the rumour is that 2.2 is going to be coming out soon. I don't have more details than that at the moment. So we're really looking at version 2.1 and adhering to that. And that breaks down guidelines into, you'll hear with the Accessibility Act, you'll hear about things being or information or interfaces being made perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So with perceivable, it's making sure that information and those user interfaces or those components are presented to users in ways that they can perceive. Operable, obviously, that the navigation must be operable. So you'll hear things about, can websites and e-commerce sites be operated via the keyboard without use for the mouse? Can information and user interfaces be understandable? So make sure that the information and the operation of the user interface is understandable to the user. And then is it robust? Is that information and user interface robust? So can we make sure that the content is robust enough that it can be interpreted by a wide variety of user agents and a wide variety of those assistive technologies that I mentioned a second ago. But it's really good. It breaks down specific guidelines around time-based media, making content distinguishable, so the use of color, audio control, contrast, resizing of text, images for text spacing, content on hover and focus. It talks a lot about providing enough time, so making sure that timing's adjustable, that the user using the service or the product has the ability to pause and stop, and they're not pressured to complete a task in a certain period of time. So you'll see this, for example, with checkout procedures within the e-commerce world, not time limiting those or extending the time that users have to complete that task. It covers off things like around preventing seizures. So for those individuals with photosensitivity, making sure that your products and services are 3 flashes or below that threshold. And then it talks about a lot about navigation. So how can you bypass blocks, provide page tilting, section headings, and much more, basically making that product and that service accessible and easy to consume. And then it has a section on conformance, so there's strict guidelines around how you declare conformance or those conformance claims, and then definitions of what it means to be accessibility supported, so compliant with those assistive technologies, if you like. Now, the important thing to mention here is, albeit we've got the brilliant Annex 1 to 6 in the regulation, which is very meaty and actually quite clear and understandable. We've got the standard, and within that standard, we've got the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So we've got all this wonderful stuff, but conforming with that standard alone might not 100% guarantee compliance with the EAA, because national laws, even though we've got the Act now, there is still a certain level, as with any regulation, member states can't reduce that regulation to make it less effective, but they can apply a layer that makes it more effective and tighter. So member states still have that ability to apply a belts and braces layer above the Accessibilities Act to make it even more effective in their country. So we know that the national laws that have come about of the member states transposing the Act into their national laws may well outline an array of other requirements for product and service providers. So a lot of those we think are going to be around how accessibility is managed within their organisation. So, how they prioritise that. So it might be, certain national requirements might include, and without going out to each member state and getting their derivative kind of local law, I'm pretty much paraphrasing here, but you might see some member states insisting that, the service or the product provider implements accessibility training for all their employees, that they have procedures to monitor accessibility on an ongoing basis, and so on and so forth. In many nations, organisations covered by the EAA are going to have to publish an accessibility statement, which is, something that's probably posted on your website, a little bit like we talked about. You have your GPSR page and now you have your EAA page, and it'll give kind of information about the functionality of your product or service, the documentation of a product or a service, its technical accessibility specifications and design processes, and then fundamentally a description of how that product or service meets the EAA's accessibility requirements. So, if you're operating an e-commerce portal, you'd basically have that the focus of your statement or your EAA page, and you talk about how you have designed your e-commerce platform to be accessible, and how it meets the EAA's accessibility requirements. And then it will have the names and enforcement authorities to which users using your platform, for example, can file accessibility complaints, and then any other additional information. So I see, it's going to be interesting to monitor over the coming weeks. I see there being an EAA page on people's websites that are looking to comply with this regulation. So businesses impacted. So importantly, goods and services, as we've talked about, it covers both some products and some services. So it impacts products and services based companies, as well as those EU-based businesses that have to comply. Also applies to third country businesses selling applicable goods and services into the EU. So, a GB-owned retail website aimed at consumers in the EU would have to comply, or a smartphone or e-reader device sold in the EU by a US-based company would also have to comply. But the regulation references several business roles and obligations that those roles carry, and it's very similar to other regulation that you've heard me talking about before. So manufacturers are a big one. The burden of compliance with the EAA quite predominantly falls with them. So they're responsible for making sure that their products have been designed and manufactured in accordance with the applicable accessibility requirements laid out in the annex and in the standard. They're responsible for drawing up the technical documentation and carrying out that internal conformity assessment procedure, and then drawing up the EU Declaration of Conformity and affixing the CE mark. That documentation, that technical documentation, doesn't have the 10-year maintenance period that a lot of regulation does. It actually has a 5-year regulation period. Moving on to service providers. So obviously, as I said before, you can't affix the CE mark to a service. So service providers within the regulation are mandated to ensure that they design and provide services in accordance with the accessibility requirements in the annex. And then they have to compile that documentation, as I say, to explain how their services meet the applicable accessibility requirements. And that has to be in both a written and oral format. And then they maintain that documentation actually for the duration that service is available. Okay, so it's slightly different depending on whether you're a product or a service provider. Now, as it's probably emerged here, I haven't explicitly said it, but if you look at the products that are within scope, you'll see that the EAA governs B2C product and service provision, essentially. But B2B, and importantly, business to government, so B2G, companies that sell, say, technology or software into the public or private sectors are probably longer term going to want to follow these compliance requirements as well, because their customers could well start insisting on conformance with the EAA standards as part of their procurement efforts. So technically, you could say this isn't a huge consideration for B2B companies at the moment, but longer term, this is only going to expand. So I think, you know, it's at least good for those B2B companies to be aware of the regulation and what it means, and slowly but surely kind of bring their products and services in line with it. Now, I mentioned before that there is a derogation. We all get very excited when we talk about derogations with regulation. So Article 14 talks about fundamental alteration and disproportionate burden. So this article is really important because it essentially talks about that derogation from the regulation. And it states that compliance with these accessibility requirements, so compliance with the EAA, need not be adhered to where meeting those requirements would result in a significant change to a product or service that fundamentally alters its basic nature. So you're completely transforming a product through making it align with the EAA. And then secondly, if meeting those requirements results in the imposition of a disproportionate burden on the economic operator, so the manufacturer, you know, that's concerned. So they're the two situations whereby you could have a derogation from the regulation. But as I said, in the annex, it does list the kind of assessment that you have to carry out to be able to prove to the authorities, this is how I'm able to use the derogation. So the regulation insists that those manufacturers or the service providers carry out that assessment, so that they can prove whether compliance with the requirements would introduce either a fundamental alteration of a product, or it would impose such a disproportionate burden on the company that it would just be cost prohibitive to do it. Now, that assessment needs to be kept and made available to the relevant authorities upon their request. And for service providers that want to use this derogation, so outside of product service providers, they have to renew their assessment either when the service is altered or there's a new service offering that's been added to it, or when the market surveillance authorities ask them to redo the assessment, or at least every 5 years. Okay, so that's kind of like the basis for this derogation. And, you know, it looks very attractive, but when you see the kind of criteria for the assessment, you might think, oh, good heavens, how the hell am I going to meet that? So I think, you know, let's not get too excited about it from the get-go. Obviously, it goes without saying that any manufacturer that's receiving funding, public or private, to improve accessibility of their products or services can't obviously use this derogation, because then they won't be able to plead the disproportionate burden or costs associated with compliance, because those costs are covered. So they're kind of like the businesses that are covered. And then I've covered some of the sectors here. So I've provided kind of like an overview of the sectors impacted. So we've got tech and hardware manufacturing, so covering things like computer, mobile device manufacturing, mobile phones, communication and telephony equipment, media equipment, e-readers, point of sale devices, and essentially the products and services. So the hardware must be designed in an accessible way. So, you know, tactile buttons, screen readers, audio output, and so on. Smartphones, for example, have to support assistive technology, and ATMs are going to have to access user interfaces and audio as well. Then software development, so operating systems and user interfaces are going to have to be able to be navigated by screen readers and include keyboard support. Apps and services have to be accessible by people with visual, auditory, motor or cognitive disabilities. Retail and hospitality, this is an interesting one. So shops and restaurants, so any point of sale devices or self-service kiosks and technologies, they're all going to have to be accessibility. This is within the EU. The UK has obviously its own act around accessibility for disabled persons, but if you were on the call today and you were manufacturing any of this hardware or software and selling it into the EU, then it would have to be compliant with the EAA. Obviously, banks and financial institutions are impacted in the EU, so their websites, their consumer banking services, their mobile apps, their ATMs, everything like that, all has to be accessible. And all digital services have to meet those accessibility criteria, so readable text, voice support, and so on. And then the one we're going to focus on in a minute is e-commerce providers. So those e-commerce providers that are marketing their services or not preventing EU consumers from purchasing from their websites and their e-commerce platforms here in GB must make sure that those websites and apps and so on are accessible. So, you know, that they might have screen reader compatibility, color contrast, local navigation, and accessible customer support. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a minute. And then media and entertainment services providers are also impacted. So media streaming, the likes of Netflix and so on, telephony providers, mobile apps, websites and so on. So streaming services have to offer accessibility or accessible navigation and content. So subtitles, audio description. Some of them are already there. I mean, we use Prime an awful lot, and you know, they've got all of this sorted out and has been for years now. But user interfaces have to be operable with people with limited dexterity or vision. It also has an impact on transport operators for, say, airlines, trains, buses, and so on. So that concerns their websites, their mobile apps, their point of sale devices, kiosks, self-service transaction machines, electronic ticketing, and so on. So the important thing here is, not that I'm thinking we've got any airlines on today's call, but you can imagine the EAA applies to airlines that are outside, maybe based, you know, there may be GB companies or airlines that are based outside of the EU, but if they have departures from within the EU, then they must comply with the EAA. So, you know, all of their information systems, timetables, ticketing, and so on must be digital and must be physically accessible. So it's a big overhaul there. And then public sector and government departments. So some of this is covered by the Web Accessibility Directive, or what we call WAD, but the EAA reinforces and expands on those obligations to private service providers working under public contracts when they're selling services into you know, a member state's national government or local government departments, they would be bound by the EAA as well. So it's quite far-reaching, but the one that I really want to focus on today is e-commerce services, because I think when I think about the ability this regulation has to impact on our SMEs here in the UK, it's around websites and e-commerce services. So I'm going to look at e-commerce in a little bit more detail because we know it's an important sector for SMEs in EU trade. Any marketeers on the call, please go easy on me. I do customs and regulation, not customer journeys and experience, so go easy on me here. But I've kind of mapped out the customer interactions with a company's website and e-commerce functionality. So I've kind of broken it down into 6 parts. So navigation and discovery. Customers can find products through various means like search engines, paid advertisements, or direct links. Obviously, they can browse product categories, explore different items, and read product descriptions. And then websites often use filters and sorting options to help customers narrow down their search. That's all in the navigation and discovery. And I want you to bear in mind all of this functionality that you provide via your website and your e-commerce platform, and start thinking about it from accessibility perspective. So those with impaired vision or impaired hearing and so on, how they would be able to access the full richness of your customer experience via the website and your e-commerce platform. So product interaction, you know, your customers can view your product details, they can see imagery and specifications, they might be able to read reviews and compare products, and then they can add items to a virtual shopping cart. How does your current service provision or your current provision at that point in the journey lend itself to accessibility by those people that have disabilities? Then you move on to checkout and payment. So customers can usually review their cart and proceed to the checkout. They can enter their shipping and billing information. Payments processed securely, often through a payment gateway, and they receive an order confirmation and tracking information. How accessible is this point in your journey? And then we move on to post-purchase experience. So customers can track their orders and they might get updates as to where their order's at. They might interact with customer service for support or returns. And then you might want to market to them as loyal customers and, provide personalized offers and incentives. How does what you do at the moment lend itself to being accessible? And then ongoing engagement. So customers might engage with your brand through social media. They might subscribe to your newsletters or email lists. And then that personalized content and recommendations can encourage that repeat purchases. So don't forget that those persons with a disability make up a significant part of our society. And by not making our services and products accessible, we're missing out on a large proportion of potential customers. So how do you, on an ongoing engagement basis, make your communications accessible? And then finally, customer support. So your e-commerce website probably offers various support channels. It might have chat, it might have email, might have phone. Your customers can seek assistance with product information, order issues, returns, and so on. How do you make that part of the journey accessible? And then I've mentioned also kind of key elements. So looking at your customer journey from the kind of touch points. So those interactions customers have with your brand at each stage. So your website visits, email exchanges, social media interactions, customer support, and so on. And then user experience, the experience that the consumer has with your website, including its navigation, its product information, its checkout process, and then personalization. So your brand's efforts to tailor the experience to an individual's customer preferences, but importantly to their needs as well. And then finally, pain points. So those areas of friction or frustration in the customer journey. And when you look at these kind of 6 parts of the customer journey and focus on those touch points, user experience, personalization, and pain points, and see it through the lens of those with disabilities, that's what gives rise to the ability to enhance the experience that they're getting from interacting with your brand. And here I've kind of overlaid the interactions I've talked about with examples of accessibility provisions that you could inject throughout that customer journey. Okay, so I've kind of got the first one, website and app are compatible with assistive technology. So that's making sure that the platform is navigable using assistive technologies like screen readers. Then alternative text. So the platform or the app provides descriptive alternative text for all images and allows screen readers to convey the image's content to users. And then keyboard navigation, I've mentioned, is a big one. These ones, obviously, where you see the arrows going from navigation and discovery right the way through to customer support. This is assuming that you make sure that these provisions are there throughout your entire customer journey. You'll hear within the regulation a lot about keyboard navigation, so making sure that the entire website is navigable using only a keyboard, so users don't have to rely on a mouse. And then use of color contrast. So the platform of the app uses sufficient color contrast between text and background to ensure that the content is readable for users with visual impairments. And then captions and transcripts. So the platform of the app includes captions and transcripts for all audio and video content. Form accessibility is important, so making sure that form fields are clearly labelled and that they provide helpful error messages for users completing those forms. So clear instructions for completing each field, especially for complex forms, and providing instructions that are accessible to screen readers. And then error handling. So when errors occur, providing descriptive error messages, ensuring that the user can address the issue and fix it, and making sure that the platform doesn't rely solely on colour to indicate errors and that instead uses text or other visual cues that are accessible to all users. Now, you'll read in the regulation the use of ARIA roles. Now, if you're like me, didn't know what these were, and I'm probably going to have something thrown at me from the other side of the office when I get this wrong, but my understanding of ARIA roles are to enhance the accessibility of dynamic content. So making sure that screen readers can follow changes. So, for example, you would use ARIA roles to define the purpose or function of an element on a web page. So if role equals button, it tells the browser that an element should behave like a button, even if it's not a native HTML button element. And again, I'm waiting for that hard object to be thrown at me across from the other side of the room. Language consistency, so making sure the platform uses clear, concise, crisp language, avoids jargon and complex phrases. Clear product information, so making sure that the platform and the associated app has clear product descriptions and pricing. Any other relevant information are presented in an accessible format considering different needs and abilities. Multi-sensory communication, so the platform making sure that that offers options like text to speech, flexible magnification, and alternatives to color-coded information. Responsive design is something that I think most websites do now, but making sure that the platform or the app adapts to different screen sizes and devices. User feedback is key, so making sure that the platform is continuously and actively seeking feedback from users with disabilities to identify those areas for improvement. And then checkout procedures, so making sure that there are not time limits imposed on checkout steps without providing users the option to extend the time, making sure the layout and structure is consistent throughout the checkout process to minimize any confusion. And then accessible digital payments, so the platform's checkout process is nicely designed to be accessible for users with disabilities, maybe avoiding capture, like those capture only verification methods, and making sure that all payment gateways are also accessible and compatible with assistive technologies. So I've kind of overlaid that customer journey with the kind of accessibility changes that you could make to help make that platform accessible and compliant with the EAA. Now, exemptions from EAA, I'm motoring on here because I have been talking a long time now. Essentially, micro businesses, those businesses with 9 employees or less than £2 million turnover, are going to be generally exempt from the EAA. That's unless they work under a public contract and they have to abide with accessibility obligations, or they provide essential services like telecommunications or banking. So largely speaking, micro businesses within the UK that provide e-commerce services into the EU should be broadly exempt from complying with EAA, which is going to be phenomenal news for some of our small businesses. And moving on to enforcement and penalties, I never like to focus on this, but you always ask, so I always put a slide in here. Obviously, product product non-compliance, formal product non-compliance, would be if the CE mark had been affixed to the product in violation of the EAA, if the CE marking should have been applied to the product but hadn't been affixed, maybe the declaration of conformity hadn't been drawn up or had been drawn up incorrectly, maybe the technical documentation is either unavailable or incomplete, and then maybe the manufacturer's details are omitted from the product. Now, for repeated or continued non-compliance, authorities can demand that a product is permanently withdrawn from the market and future supplies restricted or prohibited. So you do want to kind of like get it right if you're within scope of the regulation. For formal service non-compliance, this will be handled slightly differently. So authorities will periodically check a service provider's compliance. They will always apparently investigate consumer reports or complaints of non-compliance for a website or a platform or a service. And then once they've raised that with the service provider, they'll always follow up to make sure that corrective action has been taken and the service has been brought into conformity. Now, in terms of policing the regulation, so member states have designated their relevant authorities responsible for implementing the EAA and making sure that it's fully implemented within that market. And also those authorities are responsible for making sure that the public's informed of the authority's existence, what its responsibilities are, how it can help them, and how it can investigate cases of non-compliance. So some member states have appointed one body. I've just listed some examples here, but like member states like France have actually split surveillance across a number of different bodies. So they've got somebody managing kind of like banking, another body managing general accessibility and so on. That's quite fragmented. Now, penalties, I hate talking about this. Non-compliance with the EAA can result in potential fines and other penalties, as can any regulation. The specific nature and the amount of those fines are, as is very common, left to the discretion of the individual member states. Most member states have defined monetary fines for companies and individuals. There are some that have set aside guidelines for imprisonment for certain corporate positions as well, for kind of like grave circumventing of the regulation. The penalties will be dependent, so you'll have different levels of fiscal penalties. They'll always take into account the seriousness of the non-compliance, the numbers of units of non-compliant products or services, and the number of persons affected, and that will be taken into account before the authorities issue a penalty. Importantly, the directive does mandate that penalties must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive in their nature. So, kind of making sure that companies want to comply with the regulation, but importantly, it does provide for consumers being able to report infringements to a court and effectively to take action against a brand for not being accessible. So it's a little bit like some of the sustainability regulation that we're seeing now, and that empowering consumers to basically bring action against brands that are seen to be not doing what they say they're meant to be doing. So finally, how do we prepare? So breaking it down here, access, product and service coverage. So first of all, are you even within scope of the EAA? If you are an e-commerce provider and less than 9 employees, as I've just said with the exemptions, you're not going to be within scope. But determine which, if any, of your products and services fall under the EAA and identify any specific functional accessibility requirements that they're going to have to meet. Conduct an accessibility audit of relevant products and services. So review and audit your digital content, websites, platforms, marketing materials for their accessibility. Consider using accessibility testing tools. So testing software to regularly evaluate and ensure the accessibility of your digital content and services. And I've got a list of providers that I can send when I send through the recording of this. Develop an accessibility strategy. So create a comprehensive accessibility strategy with an actionable plan. And then that strategy outlines how your business will meet EAA requirements and address any identified issues. And the thing is, while you're in the process of complying, bearing in mind that we have the hard implementation at the end part of this month, then being able to demonstrate that you've done some of this work and you're moving towards compliance is better than not being able to provide anything, if you like. Implement accessibility training. So some of the member states, as we say, are going to insist on compliant businesses having internal procedures and processes that they adhere to put accessibility at the forefront of their design and manufacturing. So, making sure that staff are trained on accessibility standards and requirements, ensuring that all employees understand how to create and maintain accessible products and services. And then the documentation side of things, the conformity documentation is important. So obviously physical products will carry the CE mark to prove compliance, but service providers will need to publish a conformance report to document the level of conformance with the EAA. So that might go within the company's terms and conditions, or it might have a separate page on the website that provides like this official document that details essentially how the service meets the digital accessibility requirements, maybe providing a broad overview of what the service is in a manner that everyone can understand, detailed guidelines and explanations on using the service, an explanation of how the service aligns with the digital accessibility standards listed in the annex of the regulation, and then evidence in the way that the service is delivered and monitored complies with the EAA. And that information has to be made available to the public, to your customers in an accessible format. So a page on your website that can be text to speech and so on is going to be the way to go on that. Then regular evaluation and accountability, so continuously evaluating products and services against your accessibility action plan, and then kind of thinking about how this is going to expand longer term to involve those B2B relationships as well. Ensuring that those accessibility requirements are considered during your procurement processes as well, ensuring that any product that you're sourcing or importing meets those EAA standards. And then finally, monitoring regulatory updates, and hopefully we've got you covered on that. So as things become clearer, or as this regulation is amended, then we'll obviously be providing updates, whether it's just an email update or we do kind of like a follow-up webinar. And then finally, these are the next sessions that we've got planned out to the end of 2025. We've got extended producer responsibilities, the next one, that's next month. These dates are in our calendars at the moment, but as just happened with me with a chest infection, when I was meant to be running this webinar, things happen that mean we have to move them, and that's just the beauty of the downside of being a small business, I don't know. But so these dates are subject to change, but broadly speaking, they're in this order because we deem this order to be looking at when the regulation is coming in. This is the order that is best to run them in. So we've got we're doing stuff on EU VAT and Incoterms and duty. We're covering the deforestation regulation, which is a big one for a number of you. We're talking about the right to repair directive that falls into the eco design regulation. There's going to be changes to classification, labelling and packaging regulation for chemicals. We've got you covered on that. We've got changes to the EU Product Liability Act, so we're going to be talking about those. And then we'll be kind of going back to sustainability and talking about the EU Green Claims Directive and that empowering consumers for the green transition. So there's a lot of stuff coming up. Feel free to subscribe to the ones that are important to you guys. Always share them with your networks. We're always grateful. There's so many companies come to us and say, oh, such and such said we should jump onto this webinar, and that's fantastic because the more we can share, the more we can demystify regulation and break it down, the better we're able to comply with it. And and we need our small businesses in the UK to be kind of grappling with global regulation and seeing it as something that is achievable, and just getting out there and selling your fantastic products and services. As always, if there's a particular knowledge gap or impact or issue that's impacting your success, let us know. And if there's a significant body of opinion that thinks that it's a biggie, then we'll put on a webinar for that as well. And then I just finished, as I always do, with my contact details there. So